Use a valve spring compressor to compress the valve springs. With the spring compressed, remove the valve keepers and slowly release the valve spring out of compression. Once you can remove the compression tool, remove the valve springs and shims. Keep these components in order. Remove the valve from the head. Try not to force it out, which can scratch the guides. For each valve, you need to remove any carbon buildup or dirt from valves and valve head. If possible, have the head shot peened or glass beaded at the machine shop, or use Magnaflux or dye penetrant to find any cracks. Check each valve head for flatness. Note any flatness which is out of specification so that it can be corrected at the machine shop after inspection. Inspect the guides for excess wear using a dial indicator and check for recession of the valve seats. It's also essential to check for worn valve stems. Use a micrometer and replace any valves whose stems exceed specification. Worn keeper grooves. Replace any worn keepers. Thin margins. Margins should be thinner on intake valves than exhaust valves. Replace valves with excessively thin margins. Length, tension, and squareness. Replace any springs which are worn beyond specification. Recondition the worn valve guides. Replace the recessed valve seats and reface all valves which are not going to be replaced. Machine the valve seats. Lubricate the valve stems with engine oil. Install valve seals. The valve seals come in 3 different types: band, umbrella, or PC type. Pay attention to the order of assembly. Assemble valve heads. Check for leaks using either a liquid test or a vacuum test, or have them perform this at the machine shop. If the block was machined, recheck all the dimensions. Machine shops do make mistakes, but it's your job to double-check their work. Check that the oil channels and openings of the oiling system in the block are free and clear of all metal shavings, dirt and debris. 3. Wash block using hot soapy water, then blow dry thoroughly to remove any moisture from the engine. Blow out all bolt holes using compressed air to remove any debris prior to installing fasteners. Oil the components thoroughly. Install oil gallery plugs and core plugs using hardening sealer. Never use silicone sealer in these areas, which can dissolve and also could form into rubbery debris in the oiling system. Prepare to lubricate main bearings by cleaning and drying the main bearing bores and the backs of the bearings. Lubricate the inside of all the main bearings and the lip on rear main seal with the recommended OEM oil, grease. Then install main bearings and rear main seal, keeping sure install in the correct position. Install crankshaft and main caps. Grease the camshaft bearings with high-pressure grease, then install the camshaft. Since the caps are sensitive to position and direction, snug the caps and then torque them onto the block from the center moving out. Rotate crank to see if it binds up. If the crank rotates smoothly, then next check the end play. Install the timing chain or belt to specification. Be sure to align the timing marks correctly during reassembly and degree the cam. To degree the cam and set the timing, aligning the timing marks at top dead center and set the degree wheel correctly on the cam, with the crankshaft, piston timing and proper valve timing sequences for intake, compression, power, and exhaust strokes of the engine. Install new pistons, rings, gaskets, and seals. Check piston ring end gaps for OEM clearances. You may need oversize rings. If the rings are too small in diameter, they'll have excessive end gap, but if they're too large, then they'll be too tight and can bind, perhaps even breaking when the engine heats up. When you're installing, you should stagger the ring end gaps on the pistons. The tiny gap at the end of each ring are turned 180 degrees apart around the piston, compared to the next ring, reducing what's sometimes called blow-by. Be sure the oil expander ring is butted properly. Install the piston and rod assemblies. Use rod journal protectors and lubricate the rod inserts, then install and torque rod caps. While you are installing the rods, first barely snug and then torque these gradually in 3 stages to ensure that they all seat evenly and properly. Continue rotating the crankshaft after installing each piston and torquing the rod caps to make sure it still rotates freely. If gets too hard to turn, you'll know the last piston in that cylinder or the rod inserts are binding. Insert halves must snug up without the end of one insert slipping under the other half. Spin test crank after each bearing is installed. Install head gasket. The gasket may be directional, so be sure to install in the correct direction. Remember to put in the head to block bolt or the OHC belt will never run true and then shred. Only use gasket cement if the manufacturer instructs you to. Install new valve heads. Lube the bolt threads and washers with original equipment manufacturer, OEM, lubricant or sealer, then torque the bolts down in 3 stages using the OEM specified pattern. Pay close attention to both the length and the location of the bolts. Install a new valve train. Be sure to lubricate the parts as you install them and adjust the valves as necessary. Use a minimum of up-down motion, and then torque using 1 round of preload. Complete other projects which might be necessary in the rebuild. If you're doing a complete overhaul, it's likely you'll want to do other jobs at the same time while you've got the chance. Likewise, it's usually inadvisable to hook up your freshly rebuilt engine to a transmission with 200,000 miles, 320,000 kilometers, on it. You might want to install a transmission. Replace the air conditioner. Change out the radiator. Get a new starter. Prep the engine. Fill the new oil filter with motor oil before installing, and with break-in oil recommended by the engine rebuilder. Prime the oiling system by manually operating the oil pump. Fill the cooling system with a 50-50 mixture of new antifreeze coolant and distilled water. You'll also probably need to install OEM spark plugs. New distributor cap, rotor and spark plug wires. New air filter, fuel filter, crankcase filter and PCV valve. Lower the engine with the hoist. It's important to keep the engine level while lowering it into place. Use caution, and help. Fasten it to the mounting brackets and reconnect all the hoses, pipes, and wires, having ensured that they're all compatible with any new parts you've installed. Reinstall the radiator and hood, being sure to keep anything meltable clear of the exhaust headers. Go through a careful initial startup. Set the emergency brake and block up the wheels before you start the ignition. Turn the ignition. If the engine doesn't start, check the fuel delivery system. Make sure to monitor the oil pressure gauge and the temp gauge. If you notice full oil pressure, cut the engine immediately and check for fluid leaks. If you notice anything unusual, stop the engine immediately. Break it in. After you get the engine running reliably, rev it to 2000 revolutions per minute to thin out any oil on the camshaft. You'll want to run the engine at various speeds between 1800 and 2500 revolutions per minute for at least 20 minutes. 5. Pull the radiator cap to check for adequate flow or leaks before it gets too hot. Check that the battery is charging. Change the oil and filter after your first 100 miles, 160 kilometers. It's important to ease the engine into its life, and it's common to change the oil after about 100 or 200 miles, 160 or 320 kilometers, initially, then every 1,000 miles for at least the first 3 months of use.